I'm Adam Lincoln. My title is Lead Systems Integrator at Wayne State University in Detroit. This is one of the few times where that title actually makes sense to people, since this is an integration talk. But I'm sort of a general developer. I do web development on a couple teams, and I'm in charge of all of our native development and integration between any campus system and our CRM. So I'm going to get this out of the way at the start. The talk is designed to be ERP, CRM, other system agnostic. Okay, that means that the level has to be pretty high to make it useful for people. So we are a banner school. We integrate with a ton of homegrown systems that expose most of their data through REST APIs, and we use Salesforce for our CRM, so I'm just going to get that out of the way. So I hope that if you don't match those exactly, that you can get something out of this talk. My goal here today is to talk about what we've learned from 2 different CRM system launches over the span of about 3 years. And what we're doing to streamline those integrations, where we've decided that the value comes from the most, and maybe some cool stuff that you can do. So that's my goal today. Hopefully you can see that. So CRM systems on campus are not new and exciting. But I just want to ask, who here has a CRM system, at least one on campus? Most of you. But of those of you that just raised your hand, how many of you are at least aware of more than one different CRM system on campus, on your campus? And I'm just curious if those who just raised their hand, are those CRM systems from different vendors? Mostly nodding yes, okay. Okay, so that's interesting. So our situation right now is, as far as I know, people do rogue things. Maybe people are doing secret things that we don't know about. But we have a main Salesforce instance that we use for sort of everything student and recruitment, and then we have a different one that's for HR customer service purposes. That's sort of ramping up. So that's our situation. Oh, so like dealing with requests from employees of the institution for services from HR. Yeah. And so they're ramping up. They're using it to run their help desk type stuff, service desks. So I won't waste too much time on motivation. You're here, you're probably motivated. And then I'll talk a little bit about how our decision-making process for how to integrate changed, or what it evolved to as we went through these 2 implementations. I'll talk a little bit about technical approaches that we have developed, and then I want to share some things that are worth avoiding and some things that are worth moving toward. So very briefly, I just want to touch on the ways that we and others have been using the benefits of integration specifically. This isn't so much what you use the CRM for, it's what does integration give you? The first 2 major topics are for service purposes and for recruitment. And we distinguish these internally a little bit, even though they live in the same CRM instance. But to me, as the person who does the integration, they matter a lot, this distinction, because the approaches that you take for integration can change based on whether you're focused on one or the other or both, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But there are some other use cases. I know that some institutions start with CRM in advancement, and then if it goes well, they move into student areas. We have a team in economic development that uses our CRM, and they use it for more of a traditional business-to-business context. And you can imagine, this is something that we don't do, but I'm just trying to dream up things. if you have a government relation office that wants to get everybody who has an affiliation with the university to email their state legislator. It would be really great if all the people in your SIS were in your CRM, so you can very easily message all those people. Getting away from the administrative slices of the institution, and this depends a lot on your CRM's tool set. This, of course, is motivated by our experience, where Salesforce offers a number of features beyond just, hey, let's store data about people. For example, there are portal technologies. You could drive, instead of having to use a third-party automated marketing tool, in a lot of cases, you can drive that right out of your CRM. So that's super useful. Integrate for the purposes of running your communications. Reporting, we found an interesting distinction in how the reporting capabilities of a CRM fits in with the wider institutional reporting capabilities that I'll talk about in a little bit. But it fits, in our opinion, it fits a niche of reporting needs that the other tools at our institution doesn't. And a lot of CRM systems provide some kind of automated business process. That's in a ton of systems. I was talking with somebody who has used Banner Workflow to implement some really crazy stuff in their institution, and that may have not been the most efficient or simple way to implement those. Perhaps if they had done that in an easier tool like a CRM, it would have been a little bit more efficient for them and easier to maintain. So those are some advanced features that you can take advantage of if you integrate. And we in both cases of implementation for us, we ramped, we took an incremental approach. But we found a ton of value integrating with other campus systems other than our ERP. For example, we have a homegrown events management system that our web team did. We have a homegrown orientation management system that we integrate with. And then I have a colleague who pulls down test scores from the testing agencies, and of course, he takes care of putting that in our ERP, but I grab the raw data to put into our CRM. For example, ACT comes with a ton of profile data about test takers. It's really useful for us. So we bring that into our CRM too. So there are more systems than your student information system that would be helpful here. Okay. I remember I came in very shortly after the start of our first implementation, and we had decided, and there are 100 ways to do this in general, but we had decided that we wanted to start by defining the systems of record for types of data. So as you go through an initial decision-making process, it's a good place to start, but really a better place to start is, what data do you think is in scope? And you can't answer that until you answer what you actually want to do. And I bring this up because among the community of higher ed Salesforce users, there are a couple different approaches to integration that stem precisely from the answer to that first question. So the other ones are important as much for the sanity of the staff doing the implementation, but the direction you go is mostly determined by the first question. We keep Banner as our system of record for everything at application forward. We, of course, bring that data into Salesforce to a moderate extent that I'll get into, but we keep prospect data specifically in our CRM. Our CRM is our system of data, or system of record for prospect data. So we've decided to make that split. Some CRM systems provide essentially an application mechanism. So the CRM ends up being the system of record for applicants, sometimes up until admit or sometimes up until enrollment. But the division we chose was at application. we use a one-directional integration approach. We don't bring data back into Banner from our CRM. We've talked about ways to do that, but bidirectional integrations can be really difficult. Syncs are hard. If a job breaks overnight, then you have a mess. So we don't do that. And then I want to say a little bit about the technical approach that you might decide on initially. This is, you can imagine, I'm a developer. This is near and dear to my heart. Thankfully, for my job security, my management recognized early on that integration tools often did not provide the flexibility that you can get from writing your own code. But I know institutions that are happy to pay for integration appliances. Most CRM systems provide some kind of import-export thing that's very labor-intensive and takes a lot of people hours. We do mostly in-house development, but really it's going to end up being a combination of the two for the purposes of resources. We have an administrator for our CRM who does some of the basic stuff using the tools, using sort of spreadsheets and imports. And then we have automated feeds from other campus systems. So we use a combination of those. So if you contrast the first two use cases that I mentioned, I think it's easy to assume that any kind of integration has to bring everything over. And I just want to highlight that. One of the things we've learned is both in terms of the number of specific fields you bring over from a system and in terms of the number of records you bring over from an external system, you don't have to do that. The first part of this slide is sort of a traditional, hey, we want to recruit a ton of people. That means that we need to bring prospects in. We need to bring everybody from our student information system in so that we can match them and we can track what prospects did and what made them apply, what made them most likely to be admitted and enroll. That's the approach that we take because we want to run this out of our CRM. But I just want to mention that I've heard some interesting alternative approaches. There's another institution who has a more fragmented CRM system. And they have an instance that is for service only. We run service and recruitment out of the same CRM instance. But for their service-only instance, they did the integration so that it runs ad hoc. When somebody comes up to a desk or a kiosk and says, I need help, and they enter their identity information, their integration goes out through a web call. They use Salesforce. Salesforce lets you run hosted code that looks like Java. And you can do web call outs. So they wrote a web listener that implements the integration on their end. So instead of having to push over millions of records every day or all the time or twice a day or whatever, they build that data in their CRM when somebody comes in the door. So it lowers their storage costs. It keeps useless data out of their system. It's a great benefit for them. But they don't need people in there who they haven't seen. So you can get away with things like instead of fields from your ERP, you can do flags. You can say things like is enrolled, is not enrolled, instead of all the course data or something. And they do that on demand. So there are a couple different approaches. So now I'll go through a series of things that we learned that are worth avoiding and things that we learned that are worth doing. I had a little bit of trouble describing this, so it's weird at a talk about integration to talk about don't over-integrate. But one of the things that we learned, especially when if you're accessing the data from your ERP from the table level, where adding extra fields can mean your views get bigger, the runtime of your procedures gets longer, the joins get more complicated. We found that it's actually worth reducing the number of fields that come in from a particular system. That the benefit comes from touching a system at all. Even the presence of a record is super useful, and the benefits from additional fields diminish. So here's some examples. This is from our experience. So sometimes, often, only a few fields matter. For the record in a CRM for an application for admission, if you have the term, the date, the current decision, and the program, if you're sophisticated enough, that's often all you need from an application record. We don't bring over much more than this, and it's already super useful for us. We bring over registration data, but we don't bring over all the classes that somebody is enrolled in. We don't maintain that in our CRM. All we do is we say, for a term, what class are they? And that, in this context, means, are they considered a junior, a senior, or a graduate student, or whatever? And are they less than half-time or full-time? That's all we bring over. That's all we've needed for service and communication purposes. And from our event system, you can imagine the way an event system might work if it's a standalone web app is people create events on campus. They create a form that's for the purposes of RSVPs, and then they tell people, go to this link and sign up. So, but the RSVP form can hold a ton of different data. We have found that, although we're looking at bringing that data in, we found that we got a ton of benefit from ignoring those fields entirely and just saying, what event is it, and did they RSVP? And that's been enough to serve most of our purposes. That I mentioned. And we've decided that any effort to, and we've been actively, I don't know what other people's experience is, but we do occasionally get a set of users who say, hey, can't you just put everything in the CRM so that I only have to look at one screen? And we tell them, no way. You should expect everybody with 2 displays and everybody having the banner interface open and the CRM interface open. And hopefully you don't have to look at the other screen very much. But we give them access to and expect them to use, for the more complicated cases, to use the ERP's own interface to get more information. So we don't worry about reproducing that in a CRM. So this pitfall, I think, has more to do with the selection process. I've heard a fair amount about how CRM systems on campus change more frequently than other systems. I think first because the industry is moving pretty fast, and because I think it's still sort of, it's not like we're 30 years into using CRM systems. I think we're more like 15. So there's some more churn. So this has more to do with when you're evaluating potential vendors. Access methods make all the difference. And it could be both the capabilities of the system and your staffing and their ability to use them. So we first had a CRM system that had a SOAP interface, and in case folks aren't familiar, that's sort of a web services interface. You use what is kind of like a browser, but it's usually in a programming language in a library, and you make calls to a remote web address to do stuff, and you say make a record or update a record or delete a record, whatever. That was available in our first CRM system, but it was so slow that in order to update all the records that we had in it, and that, at that time it was probably 400,000 records, I'm guessing, but it took 3.5 days. And the problem is that that's hard to determine without more than a test drive. So you can see why it didn't take us very long to switch. So right now, the way that we are using the access methods that we're using to move data, and there's a ton in this schematic. I'll cover some of it later. I just want to mention one thing now. There are a lot of ways to do this, but the way we do it is a 3-step process. So if you can imagine, this is our integration with our ERP, Banner. Banner is in orange. Salesforce is over here in red. We put it in a cloud. I didn't do that. Somebody else did that. Somebody with some graphic talent did that. And then this right here is sort of a middle piece implemented in Python, just because that's what I wrote in at the time. But the point that I want to make is we're using PL/SQL to do this connection between the second layer and Oracle, which the backend for our banner instance. And this connection between the Python scripts and Salesforce uses Salesforce's bulk API, and it's crazy fast. We can move, right now we're moving almost 1.5 million records. I want to make sure I paint the right picture. We do it twice a day, but we could probably do it 4 times a day if we piggyback them. And most of that runtime is actually over here. It's not in the access method. It's in the analysis of records when they get into Salesforce. A little bit of a better illustration of the speed of the access method is through the bulk API, a subset of that, of about 1.1 million, we move in 5 minutes, which I think is pretty good. I mean, I don't know what other, but that's over, it's making a connection over the internet and dumping data, and it's done on the Salesforce side in 5 minutes. So it's worth looking at the access methods and whether you have the staffing to leverage them when you're evaluating a CRM system. I'll come back to this plot. Of course, data integrity is a big deal, but I want to come at it from a couple different angles, what I think are different angles. Instead of worrying about paying for a system that everything goes into because it's really good at finding dupes. There are a couple other things that are worth doing. We learned that from a very early stage, it's good to get everybody who's involved in a data entry point at a single table, so you can define what it means to have a record that's good enough to keep. So from our standpoint, that's admissions counselors who are meeting people at high school visits and having them fill out things. That's the web team who runs all of our requests for information. And that's the people who manage purchase lists like ACT, among others. So those people all need to sit down and decide what makes a record that's worth keeping for a prospect. Or else you can have records with a name and an email, and they're pointless. We implement our matching and merging mechanisms in Salesforce. Of course, we have them in our ERP, but that doesn't deal with prospect data. So we have some of that matching done in Salesforce. We've also learned that if you let different people do matching mechanisms, then they come up with every one of them comes up with a different idea. So it's worth the investment, probably in central IT, and this is something that we're working on now, to consolidate those matching algorithms in one place and make them a service for campus so that people can call them from whatever code that they're writing for whatever system and get a determination whether this one on the left-hand side may match any of these numbers on the right-hand side of a potential matching effort. So we decided that that's useful. I just want to say a little bit about the way that we've implemented this dupe prevention. That's the stuff here on the right. So this is all running on Salesforce's servers. As I mentioned, they have this hosted language that you can use. That's actually really cool. It does a lot of stuff. I don't know what other CRM systems provide. If it's hosted, then you can probably, if you have a CRM system that's on premise, then you can probably do a number of things. But the way we do this is we take all of these records from our ERP, we put them in a holding area, which is essentially a database table in Salesforce, and then we have code that analyzes each one. It runs a sort of a standard suspension mechanism where if it can determine that a record matches somebody else already in the system, it updates it. If it can determine that it's pretty sure it's new, it creates new records in our CRM. And if not, then right in our CRM, where our enrollment management people are every day, it presents a list of suspends and provides them with a simple web interface to evaluate the difference between the potential matches and the incoming data, and click match or new, and then it's done. So that's how we've done it. And then on the left here, I've tried to scrub as much. This is what happens when your own data ends up in a talk that gets published online. You get really careful about scrubbing personal data from slides. So there's a bunch of stuff that's removed here. But this is Salesforce Chatter. This is sort of their collaboration, social networking thing that's inside the product that, depending on how you set it up, is mostly for users. So this is for staff members, and we use it to collaborate. And so we set up some mechanisms, and we think this is really important, so that the people who are looking at data, we're moving all these records. We're not looking at all of them with our eyeballs. The best way is to give the staff a way to report these dupes, even if it's very simple. So here we have somebody who we use the support hashtags, and this is our group for support for the CRM users. They report dupes when they do happen, when they happen, and when they're found. And this is our administrator who is taking care of it. We even use it to elevate to the person who takes care of dupes within our ERP. We find through our CRM the vast majority of duplicates from our ERP because people are looking at this data all the time. Now I want to mention a couple things that we're really proud of, and we think people should be doing as much as possible. So this is a little screenshot of what amounts to a record in Salesforce that drives some of our integration code. And I'll show you a better interface in a second, but the point of all this is that we let the administrator, this is we meaning IT, we let the administrator of the CRM who's not in central IT make decisions about where data is going to go. And so this was sort of the first effort. You can imagine that he can go in and he can change this setting here and make test scores that are coming in go to different places. This is the first effort. A better way is this right here. And this gives an indication of, if you have a good CRM system, the sort of things that you can do with it. This is a way to essentially set up an update form, something we're working on right now, where if you want to send somebody an email to have their information updated, you can pick and choose which of the fields in a particular database table in the CRM that you want to be exposed to them, or that you want them to be able to update. And the cool thing about this is that a user and an administrator can go in and say, I want to send 1,000 people a request for update of information. And I want to show them their first name and their last name to be able to update that. But I do want them to be able to update their birth date. And so a user, IT doesn't have to do this, that's the point. IT doesn't have to do this. A user can go in and define a form, save it, and send it. So we think that any effort to get the control for the functional use of the CRM out of central IT is worth it. Because it's, there's not much that a developer hates more than having to go in and change the field name in a query from this field to this field, because it's so boring. So it's better to have users be able to do that. And so this wraps together a bunch of the concepts that I've been talking about. So I'll spend a little bit more time on this slide. Every institution has reporting mechanisms already. What we found is that the reporting that exists outside of our CRM that's been around for a while, it's good at making reports to give to governments. It's good at making reports for the sort of 10 most important things that end up in a portfolio that the president gives to the board. But it's not really good at agile report generation, where people who are in charge of making decisions about resources and about efforts are sitting in the meeting and want data then, and they can't tell you going in which data that's going to be. That's where reporting out of a CRM really helps. So this looks like a funnel. This is test data. We'd be in trouble if we only had 520 prospects. But this is a regular old funnel. But what's cool about this is it lives in our CRM. Is we can, and there are other tabs available, but we can, on the same display in the CRM, people sitting in a meeting with us on an overhead, we can look at the entire funnel for a term. We can side-by-side compare it to the same funnel for the previous term or any previous term. We can, for the same term, compare, for example, the difference in the way this funnel looks for off-campus events versus on-campus events, and that's a big bone of contention because of the resources that are needed for each. But we can do more than just lead sources. We can do based on event participation. We can do based on test scores, and there's a bunch of stuff that we can filter these on. And we can do this sitting. The reason we can do this sitting at a meeting is because of this integration. And I want to mention that if there are any developers in here who have done some JavaScript work, this is just regular old jQuery UI. This is open source stuff. And it doesn't take very long to put this kind of thing together once you're integrated. I get asked this question a lot. How long did this take? Last time I gave this talk, somebody stopped me 5 minutes in and asked me this question, which I don't blame him at all. And I think I politely asked him to wait. I probably should have just answered him. But the initial integration from Banner to Salesforce took about 6 months of a full-time developer. That was me. And if you have somebody better than me, it will take shorter. But that's how long it took me. And the maintenance, of course, we added these integrations over time, but the maintenance of all the stuff that I've talked about today, ERP, events, orientation, test scores, registration, probably only takes about half of my time at most. So we think that we've talked to institutions who are really wary of this kind of work because they don't think they have the resources, and we try to explain to them that we think they do. Because this number is lower than most people might expect. So I just want to very quickly hit on what I hope the takeaways are for folks, being that this is high level. Decide what you want to do with your CRM and tailor your integration plan to that. Touch as many systems as you can. Don't worry about going crazy with fields. When you're evaluating a product, if it doesn't have fast, easy to use access methods, cross it off the list. Focus on making the common stuff easier. Focus on the low-hanging fruit. Expect your staff to have multiple systems open. And some other things that we believe in that I haven't talked about yet is find a CRM with a community that loves it. You know you're in the right place. And any kind of automation is an investment worth making. So I think that's it. And there's my contact info. We talk to people all the time about this stuff. So if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. That's it. Thank you. Any questions? Sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned for your end users that you make them go into two systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
In Salesforce, and we're in conversations with Salesforce, indicated, because I asked them if this was something they could provide, they have a way of linking, kind of a, under the hood way of linking, so that a person could be here and clicks on this page, and it opens up the admissions page inside or PeopleSoft, but inside of PeopleSoft, so that they wouldn't have to do that. Is that something that you've explored?
Yeah, it does. You can do that. There's a lot of different ways to do that. There are web tabs where your external system sort of opens up in the same place. You can do things.
The key is that you're getting the same record and you've authenticated into the other system.
Yeah, so the challenge there, I think, is less about Salesforce, it's more about the other system. Is there an endpoint you can put in a link that will take you to the right place? If there is, then it's actually really easy. You can also, Salesforce can deal with SAML and some other single sign-on. So if the person doesn't have a session in that external system, there are ways to do that. But yeah, you can put links in 100 different places. You can make them look like buttons. You can put them on a specific content. You can generate them for a specific contact and make the button go right to the other place, as long as the other place supports that endpoint.
The problem that you don't have a comfortable landing page that everybody kind of goes to in Banner, that you didn't provide that, or it is frustrating for the
Yeah.
to
I think the limitations, I think the reason, well, first off, I mean, we're using Java clients in browsers for Banner. And maybe there's a way, but I'm not aware of it, where you can go to a URL with a specific number of Git parameters and it takes you to the right place in Java. Like, I don't think that works. So it's more about the ERP than it is the CRM. The CRM could do all that. Yeah.
Well, on that too, if it has, right, that's referred to as deep linking, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can go directly down into a web app like that. But what's more important is how are the users going to use it, right? If you click on a link and it takes over the screen, now they're looking at that, but some of the other data was on the previous screen. Now what do? They go back and forth. So
Well,
if
Salesforce
nothing
says
else, at
they
least
did.
open it up into a separate window so they can see them side by
Mhm.
Yeah,
side.
Salesforce says they deliver as though they're actual expense, and then we haven't got far enough to explore what that actual expense is. But they deliver it so that it would just be, you could have just a frame that's inside of your Salesforce page. So they're never leaving Salesforce. And they have a frame here that say, okay, they're going to application maintenance in PeopleSoft. And they click, and as long as that record's in PeopleSoft, there's your application maintenance. Right?
Yeah.
And that's, if everything that they need is on that one screen, that's great. If they need some stuff from the previous screen and some stuff from another screen, then embedding it and linking it doesn't actually solve any user problem.
Unfortunately, with PeopleSoft, on that particular page, you get every other page you would need in admission from that page. So it would always be able to land you in that page and go to other places.
Yeah, I think the reason for us we haven't explored that is because the context of, for the reasons you just described, you frequently, in each system, you need to sort of be drilling down in a lot of cases. And I think we considered it jarring to have a system embedded where you were following one of those paths and the context around it wasn't following that. So we just expect them to have both systems up. But there are a ton, I mean, in Salesforce, you could combine those views, like you said. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to take data from different pages, as it were, and stick them all together. There's like, I can think of 3 different ways to do that right now. So hopefully, if that's causing inefficiencies, they can be fixed. So. Any other, please?
Have you looked at all into using your CRM system for other applications around the university, more internal rather than just student attraction and retention?
Yeah, we have. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we have an instance that's used for human resources to manage interactions with employees for requests for FMLA or things like that. So that's active right now. We did explore using it for fundraising. They decided to go a different direction for now. We have an economic development team that's very small that works in our business incubator that uses this same thing all the time to talk to, that's a more traditional use, to talk to others.
The same CRM system
Yeah.
you or they didn't do their own thing?
That's right. Yep. They have 4 licenses in the same place. Yep. And the permission, we just fiddled with the permissions to make it work for everybody. That's where we are right now. We have most of our growth right now is in other student, like schools and colleges and departments are getting really interested. I mean, to me, that's the same sort of thing. It's for the purposes of recruitment and retention, but it's a different set of people. Funding those licenses is a challenge. So that's sort of what we're working through right now.
Getting everybody in all the departments.
Mm-hmm.
Follow the rules is gonna be challenging.
Yes, yeah, I think so too.
One other question. You mentioned you had 2 implementations in 3 years. Can you clarify what that meant?
Yeah, so we had a, was it 4? Kathy and I worked together at the time.
Or whatever. Why is there 2 implementations?
Well, because we had a product that didn't work.
Oh, so you had another product.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, and we got rid of it very quickly.
You might
Oh, a year and a half, it was even shorter than 3 years. We'll talk after. This is recorded. Anybody else? All right, thanks so much for coming.